A lot of things can define the last year of V-Series in 2020. A lot of good things, a lot of bad things, but one important thing is the increase of consistency that we saw in our decks. And that all was possible thanks to the new Grade 3 Searchers. And today we're going to rank the best among the best of them in, of course, a brand new tier list.
Stand up! Vanguard!
Hey Cardfighters, welcome back to another tier list where we look back at the last year of V-Series. Last time we already took a look at the order cards, which are going to play a very integral part in Overdress. This time we're going to look at the Grade 3 Searchers themselves, which aren't really a thing in Overdress, at least not now. What they definitely were a new introduction in the V-Series, which increased and shot the consistency of all the decks through the roof, and at the same time see some play in Premium as well because they're that generically good. But the important question is, which among them are actually the best? Because yes, they all have the same main skill, and yes, they all gain 5k power, but that's where the difference lies. Everyone has a different way of gaining 5k power, which makes them more useful than the other one, but also certain decks rely more on Grade 3s, as well as having certain synergies with Grade 3s themselves, which then distinguish them from better cards among the rest. So with that said, let's jump straight into this tier list and see which among these Grade 3 Searchers are absolutely the best. And we're gonna do it in order of when they were released, so we're gonna start off with the one that were introduced at the beginning of 2020 or maybe at the end of 2019, which are the ones for Team Dragon's Vanity. And that means we have the one for Shadow Paladin, and the Shadow Paladin one, it's kind of alright. Like, I don't think the Shadow Paladin can really abuse anything about them, but they're just really good generically, especially since we have the Claritor deck, which only relied on one Grade 3, and then Luard, which you want to dig to your Grade 3 as consistently as possible, thus giving you access to your Luard. So for me, Brandman is gonna be a generic B tier, and it's a good baseline to start everything from and look and put everything accordingly from that standpoint. Then next up we've got the one for Murakuma, and this is going to be for me a C tier. And yes, it's easy to gain the condition of gaining 5k, but the issue that I have with this one is that it forces you to put in resources every single turn to gain the 5k power. Yes, you always are going to do it, but that means you are also forced to do it. Like the one for Shadow Paladin, you only have to meet the condition once and you're done. And there can be certain situations where you don't bind any unit of your opponent's field. Like, if they have no rear guards, you cannot use it. If you don't have the Counterblast or Soul Blast to do it, then you're probably going to do it. Or you don't even have the units that allow you to bind something. That will be very, very hard to do because most cards allow you to do that. But certain archetypes might not even be able to do it. Like if you play Eradicators, your main Grade 3, if you have Descendant, if you don't have the soul for it, you cannot bind anymore, meaning you might not even be able to activate. So that's why this is going to be a C tier for me. Now, next up, we've got the one for Aquaforce, and this one for me is again going to be a C tier. Now, this is worse than the Murakuma one because yes, it's easy to fulfill the condition, but it forces you to have a lot of riggers on the field. And where the Murakuma one can basically say that you always fulfill the condition, like that's the main thing that the deck wants to do. In Aquaforce's case, you might not have 4 rear guards. If you run out of resource or you're up against a control clan, it's very much likely that you don't have the resource to fulfill this condition. Now, if you don't, you're probably not going to win, but at the same time, you cannot use it in the early game as you're forced to rush. All the other cards could be used on turn 1 as you could potentially activate those skills very early on. Now, next up, we've got the one for Altmal or for Royal Paladin, and this is an interesting one for me because it somewhat has a condition that you need to apply every single turn because you need to have everything face down, which might not be always useful, which can be annoying. And there aren't really some ways that you can abuse this, especially with Altmal that relies more on Grade 2s than actually Grade 3s, but we have other archetypes outside of Altmal. But I think that it's probably a C tier as well because the condition is kind of annoying, so I will put it in C tier for now, but maybe I'm gonna push it up a bit. But now we get to an interesting one. You're probably all gonna say that I'm hella biased in this one, but yeah, Steamboat Dragon for me is definitely an S tier or maybe in high A tier. And the reason for that is that Yes, it has a activate condition just like the Murakuma one where you need to do it over and over again, but the whole thing with Gear Chronicles is that you're going to stride, meaning you will have discard a card every single turn, thus activating this skill. There are scenarios that cannot happen, which could be annoying, but this is the only one of all the grade 3 searchers that can activate its own effect, because if you're able to get a grade 3, you discard a card, meaning it immediately activates its own effect. So it's the fastest among them all, and it's also the more consistent among them. But you might say it's going to need to be an A tier because there are scenarios where you cannot stride into a grade 4, thus not being able to discard a card. But at the same time, we have cards like Ear Cup, which allows us to discard a card. We have Steamboat Dragon, which discard a card. We have the new grade 2 of the Clan Selection Plus, which allows us to discard a card. So there are ways that you're able to fulfill this condition regardless of the outcome. So for me, biased or not biased, is gonna be an S tier. Now then we get to the one for Neonectar, which basically forces you to have always 2 tokens on the field to gain the 5k power. Now, this is going to be a B tier for me. Like, yes, you need to put resources in to get it. However, you don't have to constantly pump resources into it, because if you have the 2 tokens and they stay on the board, this condition fails. But depending on what your opponent is and how the deck works, this could be easy or not easy to fulfill, so it could be kind of annoying depending on the situation. Luckily, it doesn't mind what type of token, so it could also synergize with Asha, which is great because this card came out with the Asha support. Next up, we've got the one for Link Joker, and this is going to be, for me, once again a B tier, because you need to put resource into it. However, if you play the bind mechanic, then you don't have to keep putting resource into it. But the main archetype for Link Joker is the one with Messiah, and how this works and how your tech patterns play out. This card is kind of awkward sometimes to use, as it doesn't really line up perfectly with getting the 13k buff, making it not as useful as all the other cards in this list. So because it's easier to fulfill with the bind mechanic, that's a plus point, but it being a bit awkward with Messiah balances out and basically allows me to put it into B tier for what it is right now. Now next one, we've got the one for Kargaro, and for me this is going to be an A tier. Now yes, the 5k power does force you to put more resource into it to keep fulfilling the condition, but there is a big difference between this card and a lot of the other grade 3 searchers, and that's the power behind the grade 3s themselves. Like, if you run Blade Master or you run the Cross, the grade 3s that you're going to write are big bombs that you throw out down on the field. And you want to get to them as consistently as possible. Yes, this applies to every other deck as well, but there is a big difference in how strong the grade 3s are themselves for Kargaro in comparison to most other decks. Now, in Luard's case, you could say, well, Luard is the same case. And yes, to some extent that is, but in some cases the Luard players don't even run the grade 3 searches because their grade 1 slots are already filled with all the other tech choices, and they don't have the room to actually facilitate. Now, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. In Kargaro case, you always 100% play this card because you need your grade 3s. Now, next up we've got the one for Orca Think Tank, and for me, this again an S tier. Like, again, it has all the check marks as it's very easy to use. Yes, the ability is you need to use it every single turn, but the entire thing of Orca Think Tank is that you check your top deck and you reveal your cards via any effect. But more importantly, this card synergizes with the grade 3 Seer Amaterasu, which then can give you an early crit on grade 1 nonetheless, and just like Gear Chronicle, it can activate its own effect because you reveal the grade 3, thus meeting the condition of its own effect. So every single time that you place them onto the field, it's possible that it immediately gains extra 5k power, and in some cases gives your Vanguard an extra crit and 5k or 10k power, which is great. So for me, this is once again a very strong grade 3 searcher. Now then we get the one for Dimension Police, and this for me is solid A tier. Like, the archetype revolves around grade 3s, but more importantly, this is the easiest grade 3 5k power unit, because the only thing you have to do to gain the 5k power is being on grade 3. Just being on grade 3 and you're done. Like, it's not the fastest, and it's not something that can activate itself, but it's something that will activate always if it's on the field. So yeah, it's a solid one. Next up, we've got the one for Grand Blue, and this is for me basically the same as Shadow Paladin, and maybe to some extent even better Shadow Paladin, because it's a condition that will activate if you have enough cards in the drop zone. If for Shadow Paladin it's 3 grade 1s, in this case just 5 cards, which is just great to activate. And further than that, there's actually not really a lot to talk about. That doesn't apply to any other Grade 3s to any other of the Grade 3 searchers. So it's just a solid card. It's not bad. It's also not amazing. It's just good. Then followed up from Grand Blue, we have to go one for Pale Moon. And for me, the one for Pale Moon, it's kind of weird. For me, I will put it in C tier. And you might think, well, like, this could easily be a B tier because the condition is easy to fulfill and you probably will do this every single turn. But there might be a case where you don't even superior call anything from your soul, thus not fulfilling for the condition. But my main issue with this card is that you might not even have the room to actually run this card in most decks. Like, you can run it in Harry, but at the same time, Harry is cluttered with a lot of cards. And because you only run 4 Grade 3s, how consistently can you activate this card? And your field is already going to be filled with other cards, so you cannot even really benefit of the 5k power all that much. So it's kind of awkward in certain builds, because you also might not even, you're probably not going to run into Silver Thorns as well. So my main issue with this particular card is that all the main decks themselves might not even have the room to facilitate this card in the first place. So it's kind of an awkward card by just looking at it. And the fact that the condition, just like all the other Grade 3s when placed from hand, means you cannot abuse it with the whole Pale Moon mechanic, so there's not really anything special about it, unlike certain other cards like the one for Orca Think Tank or Gear Chronicle, or the bombs that we have for Kargaro. There's nothing really here to say to speak of, but it's also not bad. It's a generic consistency card, but it doesn't feel as great as all the other Grade 3s for the other clans, so that's why I put it in C tier for what it is. Now, as for the Murakuma card, the condition that you need to have 2 specific cards basically puts it in the same scenario. However, because Murakuma has the synergy with the drop zones and the fact that you can discard cards and then you have the Grade 3 Yasue Tenma that can then superior from the drop zone, I will put it in B tier. Because there's actually some combo potential that you have. You can even combine it with Shiryuki, because Shiryuki can be fetched from the drop zone. So let's say you have Rainy Madame, but you don't have a Shiryuki in drop. You can use this to ditch the Shiryuki just to set up the plus that you can generate through this, thus negating the discard that you have to do with this card, which is some interesting plays that you can make with this card. So the overall effect itself isn't all that great. It does synergize with the mechanic and in the clan, but it's the fact that the clan can abuse the discard cost to some extent, which makes this card all that much better. And speaking of that, I will put the Grade 3 for Grade Search for Grand Blue up, because Grand Blue has the same benefit effect with that thing, because you can discard Ghost Ship and Skull Dragon, thus making the discard even all that better. So yeah, we'll put that one up to A, now that I think about it. Then followed up, we've got the one for Dark Regulars, and for me this is going to be, it's going to be, you need to soul charge a card every single turn, which is kind of, it's easy to do, but at sometimes you just don't want to soul charge anymore. So there might be scenarios where this thing will shut off. So because of that, I will put it in C tier. Like, again, keep in mind, this is all in context of the Grade 3 search themselves. So the C tier Grade 3 searchers are still like A tier in the generic scope of things of all the cards. But in terms of the Grade 3 searches, this could actually be annoying, because for needing to soul charge every single turn, if the game goes on too long, at some points you just stop soul charging because you go deck out. Thus this thing shuts down and nothing really happens. So that's kind of annoying. Now the same thing can be said for the tachycardia one. Like, they both have the same issue. This needs the soul charge every single turn, this needs to equip every single turn. Both of them have ways to soul charge from the drop zone or equip from the drop zone, but that's not all that easy to fulfill. Like, the Dark Regulars one is a lot easier if you have the Grade 1 in the field, but depending on how easy your opponent can remove them, that might be kind of annoying and then you're stuck. So I will keep them for here for what they are right now. The next up, we've got the one for Spike Brothers, and this one forces us to superior call every single turn, which might or might not always come up. Like, the build, depending on what build you play, this could be easily be fulfilled or not. But the reason why I will put it into high B tier, like I think here, middle B tier for right now, is because the fact that you search your Grade 3s is even that more important in Spike Brothers than most decks, because you have your Rising Nova deck. Now, Rising Nova needs you to have all the Great 3s on the field, thus having the Great 3 Searcher is even that more important. But it's not as important as you think, because they have the Great 1 Ambush Dexter and the Great 2 Lona, I think, that allows you to just superior call the Great 3s onto the field, so they are definitely way better than this card, but at the very least this card doesn't cost you countless or soulless to do so. Then follow up, we've got the one for Mega Conley, and the Mega Conley one is going to be C tier for me. Like, it's, in contrast to the rest, it's really bad. Like, certain decks do rely on the Great 3s on rearguards and whatnot, so they have that, but they aren't as important as other decks. Like, they are combo extenders, but they aren't the prime thing for pushing your power. The main thing is that the conditions to gain the 5k power is something your opponent can play around. They need to have no standing units. And yes, Mega Colony can rest those units, but the main support of the last support wave that we've seen so far does absolutely nothing with stunning our opponent's units. Ghidorah doesn't really stun. The new Fighters Collection Venom Stinger doesn't stun. Gunnincolio doesn't stun. So you aren't really enforcing this idea, which is kind of awkward. So it basically relies on, did your opponent attack with everything, or did they at least let one unit standing on the field, thus shutting down this 5k power? So it's not that great. Next up, we've got the one for Nubatama, and this is at the same condition as the Neonectar one, only you need only one token instead of two. However, this is going to be lower, and I think it's going to be low B tier, because tokens aren't as prevalent in Neonectar, and the amount of token support is also much more limited. But its saving grace is the fact that Shiranui exists. And with Shiranui or Burrow, that whole mechanic, you need to have the X amount of Great 3s in your soul. And the fact that almost every finisher in Nubatama is a Great 3. So all that is a saving grace of this Great 3 Searcher. You might say maybe even here high B, low A, because the entire clan relies on Great 3 finishers. So you know what? With the new Hanzo being a thing, and that means you need to have multiple Hanzos in your hand. You know what? Yeah, I'm gonna put it in A tier, because the 5k power might not be as impactful, but the fact that the Great 3 Searcher effect, because everything relies on Great 3 pushing power, means you need something like this. So because of that, I will push it to A tier. Next up, we've got the one for Nova Grappler, and it's basically just standing something. Now, the Great 3 Searcher isn't all that great, but we have Blouse. And Blouse are definitely carrying that Great 3 search potential way more. So, and we have the Beast Deity, which definitely can abuse the Great 3s to some extent. So I think the one for Nova Grappler is just solid overall. It's just bang average. Its condition to gain 5k power isn't that hard to meet, as it's the entire clan does want a restand. So that makes sense. And the Great 3 search ability can be abused to some extent and has some inherent synergy, so you know what, it's fine. Now, next up, we've got the one for Great Nature, and the Great Nature one, yeah, it's really easy to fulfill. Like, it's probably high B tier, because you just need to have a unit on the additional rearguard circle, which is just having a unit onto the field. You only need one. It can be itself, so it can easily become a 18k attacker, or maybe a 23k attacker, so that's nice. The Great 3 search ability, there's not really something that it can abuse all that much besides just generic Great 3 attackers or rearguard units. Maybe the Hamskate support can utilize it to some extent, but not really something that I can immediately see like this is an interesting combo that you have like some other clans. Now, next up, we've got the one for Gold Paladin, and Gold Paladin is once again of those generic cards. Like, it's just okay. Like, this card would have been way better if Gurgrit and Percival were still legal, because then, yes, searching for a Great 3 where Percival is kind of ridiculous, but at the same time, you might even rather not want to do it with this skill, because you much rather want to get Percival off of a superior call effect, thus extending your combo plays mid-battle. But overall, Gorbadoc is very generic, it's very whatever, in contrast to all the Great 3 Searchers, as it still forces you to put in value and resource to keep activating it, and there aren't really some crazy combos that you can get out of getting multiple Great 3s in your hand, as far as I'm aware right now. Well, next up, we've got the one for Angel Feathers, and this is once again a bang average, because it's basically a very easy thing to fulfill. Now, what does carry this card to some extent, which allows you to put it higher, is because once again, it's a clan that focuses on grade 3 finishers with Hospital, Hamiel, and all that kinds of jazz. So having a great way to search for those cards is actually really, really important. So having this card is actually way better than just your typical deck. So that's why I think the condition is kind of whatever, but the searchability is really, really good for this deck. You know what? It's the same case nubatama. Do I push it up a little bit? No, I will keep it here because the condition, it has less amount of finish power than actual nubatama that has way more different grade 3. So I will keep it a B tier. Now next up we've got the one for Genesis, and it being a grade 3 searcher is really good because we have the Poet deck, we have Vanguard, we have Himiko, but even though, I'm curious though, I don't even think that the Astro Poet deck runs this card because they don't have the room for it, as they already completely filled out with the support cards itself, which defeats the purpose of this card to some extent. Yes, for Fender it's nice because also Vanguard is a rearguard unit, which is a grade 3, and Soul Blasting, you're going to do that every single turn, but it's something you need to keep sinking value in it, which, yeah, puts it at C for me. It's kind of whatever in comparison to the rest. Like, it's not that great, if I'm going to be very honest. And then we've got the one for Bermuda Triangle, and this for me is an A tier, a solid A tier. Like, its condition is so easy to fulfill, but more importantly, so many builds and so many archetypes can abuse this because there are so many different grade 3s that can utilize, or builds that utilize grade 3s, like Melody, for example. And I'm not even sure if Melody uses this card, but we have Coral, Pacifica, Riviere, all the new VRs for the last set. Like, there are so many builds that can utilize this card, which makes this way more versatile than, of course, any other grade 3 searcher that we have seen. However, I do think I need to make some changes to this list because there's nothing in D, and I think B and C are a bit oversaturated with cards that could definitely go a bit down. So I'm going to move them a little bit. So we're going to have a couple of changes. I think this is a nice way to finish it up. Like, the D tiers are cards that can either shut down completely or can potentially lose you the game if you want to forcefully activate them, like the Tachycardia one and Dark Reggers. Like, these grade 3 power cards can shut down entirely for the rest of the game. And they don't have inherent synergies with their nations or clans or specific grade 3s, which can potentially abuse them or save them to some extent. Then for C, we have grade 3 search that you need to pump in value resources every single turn to keep activating them. And in the case of the Great Nature one, it's relatively slow and it doesn't really help you a lot more than certain other grade 3 searchers can to some extent. Whereas B are either cards that just activate and they're done, like the Shadow Pendulum one. Once it activates, you're basically always activates. And some of them have inherent synergies or useful plays within their respective clans that can actually abuse them. Now, I do think the Gold Pendulum one should go down. Like, it doesn't have really inherent synergies and it forces you to put in value every single turn. So that shouldn't be in B there. And of course, A, C, and S and A didn't really change. They are still ridiculous. Like, yes, Gear Chronicle and OTT aren't the strongest clans. Now, Gear Chronicle is to some extent. But the great researchers, they, 1, activate themselves, and 2, have inherent synergies within their respective nations for what they can do. Like, the Oracle Fintech one, being able to activate Amaterasu is kind of ridiculous, especially in the early game. And the Gear Chronicle one, being able to get consistent access to your entire engine, which is your grade 3, because your entire engine relies on your grade 3, is way more impactful than any of the other clans that are literally beneath it. But it is actually really, really that important for the clan itself. So that's why, for me, it's personally an S tier. Now, again, this is my opinion, and completely my opinion. So if you're disagreeing with my opinion, you can go to the link in the description and make your own tier list and send it to me at my Twitter account at Mr. Timeleap and tell me how wrong I was about this tier list. But besides that, you can go down to the comments and tell me how right I am about this tier list. But with that said, this video has been brought to you by our lovely patrons over patreon.com/FingInsider. You guys are amazing. If you want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply go to patreon.com/FingInsider and become a patron as well. But with that said, I'm Mr. Timeleap, and I'll see you guys in the next one.